In 1974 of the Third Age, the Kingdom of Arthedain, the last remnant of Arnor, fell to the forces of Angmar. This was the end of the Northern Kingdom, leaving only Gondor to carry the legacy of ancient Numenor for the next 1,000 years. But what if the roles were reversed? What if instead of Arnor that fell, it was Gondor? What if the Northern Kingdom was the only survivor? Due to popular request, let's ask the question, what if Gondor fell instead of Arnor? I've said this plenty of times in the past, but I'm not a big fan of what-if scenarios, mostly because a lot of them aren't as simple as, what if A happened instead of B? Instead, you have to take into account a lot of variables, and this scenario is no different. For example, when does Gondor fall? Who is responsible? Likewise, we have to ask similar questions about Arnor. Does the kingdom still split? Does Angmar still rise in the north? In normal circumstances, the variability in what happens is enormous depending on how you answer all of these different questions. But the reason why I'm entertaining this request is because I think regardless of the variables, the outcome is bad. Really bad. Let's opt for the most simple scenario where we just transplant Gondor into Arnor's role. Instead of the Witch King going north to found Angmar, he instead refounds Mordor, taking advantage of the Kinstrife or the Great Plague. He begins attacking Gondor, and with the help of the Easterlings and the Haradrim, he is able to destroy the kingdom around the same time Arnor was historically destroyed, near to the end of the 20th century. This isn't actually that far-fetched, because Gondor could have been destroyed during the final phase of the Wainrider invasion, which took place around that same time. Gondor was only saved by brilliant leadership and poor decision-making on the part of the Wainriders. First, let's talk about the consequences of Gondor's destruction. As you're probably aware, Gondor was the main bulwark against the Shadow of the East and South. Up until the middle of the Third Age, Gondor regularly defeated the Easterlings of Rhûn, they subjugated the Southrons of Harad, they ensured that no evil would return to Mordor, their navy, that was based out of Pelargir and Umbar, ruled the waves. Gondor's strength allowed for relative peace in the lands behind the Anduin, with the exception of what was going on in Arnor. The Northmen grew strong, the elves were not forced to go to war, everything was going well. Even as Gondor weakened, it still acted like a magnet to the forces of evil, taking blows and absorbing them fairly well. The enemies of the Free Peoples only crossed the Anduin on a few occasions, and their presence was never lasting. So it's safe to say that Gondor falling would be an absolute catastrophe. The biggest shield of the Westlands would be gone, allowing all sorts of enemies to cross the Anduin without any fear. Peoples like the Northmen, the Elves and the Dwarves would come under greater assault, and would also be put under siege or destroyed. And they were aware of this. When deciding to ride to Gondor's aid during the Balkoff invasion of the early 26th century, Eorl the Young of the Aethiod says, "If the Mundburg falls, whither shall we flee from the darkness?" Mundburg was the Northman name for Minas Tirith. Basically, if Gondor falls, everything east of the Misty Mountains would gradually be consumed by Sauron's dominion, much as it was during the dark years of the Second Age. But this time, it's worse because there's no great power to counterbalance like there was with Gil-galad or Numenor, because unfortunately in this scenario, we're only left with Arnor, and as much as I love Arnor, it would not be capable of saving the day. Because from the early Third Age onwards, Arnor was the sick man of Middle-earth. Okay, so in a situation where Gondor is destroyed by the Witch King, we're assuming that Angmar doesn't arise in the north. In this timeline, Arnor should be a great power. Or would it? Because regardless of the Witch King's presence, Arnor was not exactly in a good state itself. The losses the Arnorian army took during the War of the Last Alliance resulted in depopulation within the kingdom itself, the abandonment of many fortresses, including the eventual abandonment of the capital at Annúminas. And then of course we have the dissolution of Arnor, which occurred in the 9th century of the Third Age, resulting in the three successor states of Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur fighting each other many times over the next few centuries. What I'm saying here is that regardless of outside influence, Arnor was already in a fairly poor state, even as Gondor was hitting the height of its power. Of course, in a scenario where Angmar doesn't arise, there is a possibility that Arnor unifies and has something of a resurgence. After all, we did see Cardolan bend the knee to Arthedain in 1349, and who knows what Rhudaur's trajectory would have been if not for Angmar's influence. That said, given the long lives and the slow growth of the Dunedain, as well as their gradual waning, I don't think any Arnorian resurgence would put it on the same level of Gondor, which was always much more populated and was far more powerful, even if Arnor originally had the prestige of being the senior kingdom. That is to say that if Gondor falls, I don't think Arnor would have the capability of launching a successful counterattack to retake the kingdom, which I have done as Arnor in the Realms of Exile mod for Crusader Kings 3. Instead, I think Arnor would be forced to defend itself if Sauron's forces wish to advance beyond the Misty Mountains. And this would not have been easy for Arnor. Firstly, fortresses such as Aglarond and Angrenost, Helm's Deep and Isengard, were designed to defend against forces from the west, not from the east. So in a situation where Gondor falls, occupying these fortresses would do little to aid Arnor. Arnor would have a major bulwark named the Misty Mountains, but these mountains aren't that impassable, and importantly, they were largely already occupied by orcs. As the Rohirrim were forced to acknowledge on many occasions, the Gap of Rohan wasn't actually that easy to defend, and if Arnor pushed its frontier into Enedwaith, they might also be harried by the Dunlendings who lived there. As Sauron's forces spread north through Rhovanion, they might also then have the ability to send forces through the Redhorn Pass near to Moria, or the High Pass near to Rivendell, or perhaps even further north through Gundabad and Angmar. While these would all be highly defensible positions, they were also incredibly far apart, and the terrain on the western side of the mountains was rugged and either uninhabited or sparsely populated. Basically, if an enemy breaks through, your emergency forces will have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles through terrible terrain. What made the Gondor-Anduin frontier so powerful in the late Third Age is that it was compact. After Rohan was founded, forces from Minas Tirith could reasonably reach anywhere along the Anduin frontier in no more than a few days. And finally, Arnor has a massive coast, but as far as we're aware, they didn't really have a navy. We saw that during the long winter, corsairs were able to put men ashore at the mouths of the Isen, so why not the Gwathlo or the Brandywine? Why wouldn't they be able to sail upriver to places like Tharbad or possibly even Sarn Ford? Although Arnor's populated regions were far from the coast, which means they would have time to combat any forces that came ashore, it would still be another frontier that they would have to keep an eye on. Of course, Gondor did have the same problem, but Gondor had a navy and a strong naval tradition. This isn't to say that Arnor would immediately be overrun. They would have the help of the elves of Lindon and Rivendell and any refugees that have fled west. You also have to keep in mind that at this time, Sauron had not even officially returned, so it's not like there would be immediate huge-scale invasions of Arnor. The kingdom might even hold out for centuries, perhaps even to the end of the Third Age, or rather, what was the end of the Third Age in the main timeline. However, it is to say that I don't think Arnor would be capable of restoring Middle-earth. They would be capable of holding on to what they had, and perhaps then only barely and only for a while. I also want you to keep in mind that this scenario is actually a little generous. Like I said earlier, there was a real chance Gondor could have fallen in the 20th century, without the hypothetical Witch King popping up in Mordor. So if we keep things the same as they were, Witch King founds Angmar, doesn't go to Mordor until after, and we simply swap the fates of the kingdoms, Gondor falls to the Wain Riders, Arnor miraculously overcomes Angmar, then the situation is even worse because Arnor would have been war-ravaged and a shell of its former self by the 20th century. If Gondor falls in that scenario, there's a good chance the Wain Riders could have just kept going west if they wanted to, and then they could probably finish off Arnor as well. Realistically, when Arnor fell, it was a disaster, but if Gondor fell, it would have been a catastrophe. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Westlands would have been doomed. Arnor just would not have been able to fill Gondor's shoes, and all the lands east of the Misty Mountains would have been gradually lost to Sauron's minions. I think the only way Arnor would be able to step up is if A, it took only a few losses in the War of the Last Alliance, and B, it never actually split apart. But if we're changing so many variables, we may as well also add that Arnor gains access to a company of Space Marines. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. To the people who suggested this video, I hope it answered your questions. Honestly, I suspect that you already knew what the answer would be. No Gondor equals bad time, no Arnor equals bad time but nowhere near as bad. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Tolkien never said Middle-earth didn't have space marines, so I suppose you can argue that they did exist somewhere.